Welcome back to day 2 of our Textiles and Manuscripts workshop. I'm very excited to introduce this session's co-discussants, Alison Ohta and Paul Hepworth. And before I do that, I just want to note that this is a little different than the other sessions that we have done where the original co-discussants who recorded the videos are actually talking at the workshop. In this case, the original co-discussants, Karin Schepper and Sabine Schmidtke, couldn't make it to the workshop. And so we've invited Alison and Paul to present, and it's been a wonderful extension of the themes and material that were presented in the original video. And luckily they've agreed to also share these on the workshop website. So these will go up as well. Especially, extending material to the Mamluk and Ottoman traditions. So I will introduce them and then they will give their presentation. So Paul Hepworth is an independent conservator of Islamic manuscripts and textiles. He's based in Istanbul, and he trained at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York and then worked as a manuscript conservator at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, focusing on their very rich collection of Islamic manuscripts. He's a co-author of the terminology for the conservation and description of Islamic manuscripts and curriculum design for conservators of Islamic manuscripts. And this will be very helpful for us. I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about our discussions about terminology as well as cataloging, since they really do go hand in hand in allowing us to access manuscripts that will further this type of research. He's worked throughout the Middle East and Malaysia, training conservators and doing that important work, and is now involved in the exciting creation of a conservation program at the new Museum of Ottoman Textiles, planned to be built in Istanbul. Alison Ohta is the director of the Royal Asiatic Society in Great Britain and Ireland and London. And her foundational research has been on the bindings of the Mamluk period from 1250 to 1516. But she's also lectured widely and published on a range of binding and illumination in the Islamic world, especially Mamluk and Ilkhanid manuscripts, as well as contributing to Islamic book binding and the themes of the look of Islamic binding in the European book. Among her many publications is the recent volume entitled Art, Trade, and Culture in the Islamic World and Beyond, from the Fatimids to the Mughals, in which she was co-editor and contributor. And her most recent article is her contribution entitled Looking Inside the Book, Doublures of the Mamluk Period in the Festschrift for Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom, entitled The Making of Islamic Art, that is due out this year. Is that right, Alison?
Actually, it's already come out.
Oh yeah, excellent, great. So we can all check that out. Okay. Well, please join me in welcoming Alison and Paul. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're very pleased to be here, and we want to thank, of course, Karin Schepper and Sabine Schmidtke for their work on the previous video, and thank you to the organizers for this event. This first map is to remind us all of the enormous geographical area that's included in the Islamic manuscript tradition, from the Indonesian archipelago in the east, up through Malaysia, across the subcontinent, through Central Asia, all through the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Central Africa. And not surprisingly, since the tradition went for a very long time up through the 19th century, there are really huge numbers of Islamic manuscripts still surviving. And this is just a few of the major collections. And as you can see, they extend from all through Europe, North America, and Australia, as well as throughout the Islamic world. And these manuscripts number in the millions, it is estimated. Many of them have not been cataloged properly yet. And so I think it's a very appropriate place to start today on, since the topic is textiles and manuscripts, to remind everyone that although we're going to be showing you a lot of textiles today, in fact, in terms of the numbers, the use of textiles for decorative purposes in Islamic manuscripts is really very small. And so that's something that we'll need to keep in mind and we'll need to come back to.
Right. Hello, everybody. As we've seen from Karin's previous presentation, textiles have been used in a multitude of ways as threads for the sewing, in creating end bands, for doublures, for covers, and also as satchels to protect manuscripts. But today I'm first going to start with looking at early textual references found in the sources on the use of textiles with manuscripts. And perhaps one of the earliest references that we have is that we're told that the followers of Al-Hallaj in the 9th century, he was a Persian mystic, possessed books of Chinese paper which were covered in satin and silk. Later on, in 1174, we're told that Salah ad-Din sent 5 Qurans to Sultan Nur ad-Din, the Emir of Aleppo, 2 of which were bound in blue and pistachio-colored satin. And a little bit after that, Ibn al-Wardi wrote that the jurist al-Tahrir, who died in 1335, had an embroidered satin cover worth 4,500 dirhams, prepared for a copy of a Quran in Damascus, dating back to the Caliph Uthman. And if you remember that the Caliph Uthman, of course, was responsible for the preparation of a standardized version of the Quran. Now, in turning to the extant evidence that is available, the earliest surviving corpus of Islamic bindings can be dated to the 9th century. And these are box bindings with wooden covers covered in leather in the horizontal format. And here we have an example, which is now in Cairo, where twine, or I suppose string we might call it, is used to delineate the design on the cover. Other early examples include the bindings of Qurans discovered in the pigeon house of the Great Mosque of Kairouan. These were discovered and published by Marseille and Poinceau in the 1940s. And if we could have the next slide. And here is an example. You can see that this is from the 11th century and again is in this horizontal format and is a sort of a box binding. Now, from the evidence they produced, they were able to trace the transition from the horizontal to the vertical format, with which we're mainly, well, we are familiar with now, and wooden boards to pasteboards, and with the inclusion of the very noticeable Islamic flap. And on later examples dated to the 13th century, they detected threads of green and pink silk in what would have been used for the doublures of 2 bindings. And if we go on and look to the Mamluk period, we know that Islamic sources tell us of vast libraries in existence in Baghdad and Cairo in the 8th and the 11th century during the Abbasid and Fatimid caliphates, but it is only from the Mamluk period that substantial numbers of manuscripts survive with their original bindings. And here on the screen, you can see the image of a doublure of patterned silk. These are quite rare, as usually the doublures, textile doublures, are of plain blue, green, or sometimes pink silk. And here we have this example with a pattern of ogival forms and floral stems, with an inscription which reads Al-Malik al-Sultan, the king, the sultan. And this is found on a manuscript with a dedication to the sultan's library. And as textiles with inscriptions were considered prestigious, often suggesting proximity to the person of the sultan, This one is thus very fittingly placed on the doublour of a manuscript destined for his library. Textiles saturated Mamluk society, often serving as status symbols of wealth and position. The textile industry was described as the mainstay of the Mamluk economy, and Mamluk fabrics were exported to the Far East between the 13th and 15th centuries. However, silks were also imported from China, and the introduction of chinoiserie was perhaps one of the most significant developments in textile production, as chinoiserie motifs begin to appear on textiles as in the late 13th century. And here on the left, we have a Chinese silk damask with the titles of Al-Nasir Muhammad, who was a sultan in the early 14th century. And again, this would have been made for him, commissioned by him for the market. And on the right, we have a drawing of red damask influenced by Chinese silk, which was produced in Egypt. So we can talk about this import of large volumes of silk. There's a well-known reference by Abu Fida of the presence of 700 silks sent from the Ilkhan in Iran, Abu Sa'id, to the Mamluk Sultan Al-Nasir Muhammad as part of the 1323 peace treaty, and is usually cited as the evidence for the large-scale import of Mongol silks. And here we have an example. I'm afraid it's not a great slide, but you can see this sort of floral decoration. If we can go to the next one, here's one with sort of a patterned silk again with these sort of Chinese or chinoiserie type clouds. And we go to the next one. And here, this is very distinct. You have the telltale swastika, okay, used of course in Buddhism, and found very extensively on Ilkhanid bindings as well. So you can see this close relationship between the two. If we turn now to block printed leather doublours, if we can have the next slide, thank you. Block printed leather was used for doublours in bindings in the Islamic world. In the Mamluk Sultanate, it was used certainly from the 13th to the 16th century. In Iran, it doesn't seem to have been used much more after than the end of the 14th century. And in Ottoman Turkey, the use certainly declines after the middle of the 15th century. Now, the reason I'm showing you these slides is I think that there is a definite association between the designs that were employed on block printed cotton textiles imported into Egypt from India, from Gujarat, and of course, these doublours. For the designs of doublours of the block printed textiles, we can look at examples in the Newbery collection in Oxford, which have been collected by Percy Newbery, the Egyptologist, during his stay in Egypt between 1900 and 1930. And there are over 1,000 of such examples, and they were studied by Ruth Barnes. And you can see here with this example, which is actually quite a rare one, but and the correlation between the design on the left, which is the cotton, block press cotton, and the leather doublour on the right. And of course, Indian cottons flooded the whole area and were very, very popular and over very long periods of time. I should also say that this morning I discovered another example of this pattern in the V&A collection. So you see, there we go. Now, if we move on to the next slide, silk is also found on filigree work found on Mamluk covers. This example is a later one from the late 15th century. It's on a series of juz of Qur'ans for Sultan Khush Qadam. And here we have blue silk being used for the central medallion of the upper cover, and of course green silk being used for the corner pieces. Mamluk binders placed the filigree work on the covers in spite of its susceptibility to damage, while Persian binders used filigree work almost exclusively, I think, for the doublures from the end of the 14th century. And this was on a pasteboard ground, not a textile ground, as we find on these early Mamluk examples. I have to add here that, of course, later in the middle of the 15th century, we do find pasteboard being used as the backing for filigree doublures, all right, as a result of influence, I think, from Persia. But here we can see this is one of the early examples. This is late 14th century, and you can see the textile backing for the filigree in the corner pieces, the flap, and of course, the central medallion. Textiles continue to be used in the Ottoman period. And here we have tabby weave bindings made for Mehmet II, and the striped tabby or plaid tabby. And there are 34 known examples, and they date to the 1460s and 1470s and are thought to have been produced in Edirne, although the continued production actually is quite short-lived, and the explanation of why when it was not continued is not particularly clear. If we move to the next slide, we can see again on the left, this is another binding of a manuscript for Mehmet II, dated March 1481. It has this chinoiserie type decoration. The provenance is uncertain of the silk, whether it's a Chinese silk or a Chinese style silk. It's quite difficult to tell the difference. And on the right, we have a velvet binding where the upper cover is in red velvet, also made for Mehmet II. And again, I think there are 49 that, in fact, of these bindings that were identified by Raby and Taninda. Now, I'm going to, I think, hand over to Paul at this point.
Yes, thank you. This binding from the 16th century is a fabulous example of what you can do if you're a very, very wealthy empire and you are devoting a lot of resources to the arts. The binding is in fact done with pure gold wire, and you can see in the detail shot on the right how the wire is couched to the lower, to the ground of leather with a silk thread. And this technique, which from the same binding you see two shots on the left showing how the wire is twisted and laid down to create these lovely patterns, and how it relates, I think, very, very clearly to the couched cording that you see on the right, which is, in this case, couched to a wool ground. And it's used extensively in Turkey, but throughout the Middle East and North Africa for garments and other types of textiles.
And we return to embroidery. This is a loose binding in the V&A, dated to the 19th century. And here the embroidery, if you like, technique differs, of course, from what Paul has just described, whereby the metal threads were couched in. Here, this is done in a form of a chain stitch into the leather, and is really quite remarkable. I don't really know of another example like this, but you can see how closely the stitches are together and how it's done in such amazingly, amazing sort of close detail. So we go to the next slide, and this is Paul.
This is a doublure from the 16th century, and it's Safavid, and it shows you the very colorful medallions and areas that are blocked out in various colors with the filigree leather work. And if we go up close, what's interesting about it is that the blue areas were done with paint, which is somewhat more expected, but all the other colors are backed with these brilliant colors of silk. And that seems to be a clear development of the earlier tradition that we saw the Mamluks using of putting cloth behind the filigree work. And it's interesting in this case because this particular Quran is part of well, it's one of a group that all date from the same time and were made in Shiraz. And all of the others, these various colors behind the filigree, were done with paint, all of them. So that one exception in this group, I don't know how exceptional it will turn out to be overall, is somewhat of an anomaly. And it would be interesting to know more about why they're still using the fabric in that way. On the left, you see the earlier bindings from Mehmet II that Alison showed you before. And on the right, you see two manuscripts also from the Topkapi. Well, they're not from Topkapi, but they were made in the Sultan's workshops in Topkapi, and they're now in another collection. And what it shows is that in the 17th century bindings, there is still a continuation of that earlier tradition of textiles being used on partial leather. In this case, it's silk velvet. And it is an interesting line of research for someone. I don't know of any research that has been done which follows the development of these partial leather bindings between those earlier Mehmet II bindings and these later 17th century bindings. And I'm guessing that there are probably other examples in between which would show intermediate forms in the use of textiles in this way.
Here we have a book of prayers from the Khalili collection, datable to the 18th century in Iran. And again, you have this partial leather binding with this the silk. The silk is probably Indian, and as we know, large quantities of Indian textiles were imported into Iran in this period. We've chosen this one from the 18th century because there are not that many that I know that have survived from earlier periods. I'm sure there are some, and we'll need to look into this further, but and I'm sure textiles were used very extensively in the earlier periods, but this is one that we had to hand. So we don't mean to suggest that they weren't used more extensively before.
Here is another example that's coming in the 19th century, and you can see that the manuscript is covered with a watered silk. It may be a European binding to which the Qajar emblem has been applied, or it may be using a watered silk in Iran and then putting the emblem on, but it's clearly making a reference to Europe, and it's showing that textiles at this point now have that broader reference, that the European influence is clearly there.
And now we move to an Indian binding. Again, this is a manuscript that was copied in 1520 in Herat, but was rebound in India in the 19th century. And you can see the green velvet central panel, which I think has a direct, you can make a direct comparison with those that Paul just included that were produced in the Ottoman court workshops. And if we move on to the next slide, here we have an example how perhaps aspects of the Islamic book were combined with local traditions, and we move to the Malay world. We can see the inner layer of this manuscript, of this binding, I should say, of plaited palm, and then this Indian cloth cover. And we have to thank Annabel Gallop for these slides. And it's thought that this block printed cotton came from the Coromandel coast. And again, Indian textiles played really an important part in being, they were exported very widely both east and west, and were used certainly for covers of manuscripts.
I'd like to point out also in this slide, this use of textile, floral, quite brightly colored on the exterior of the manuscript, which we haven't seen a lot of up till now.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to emphasize again later in this program, is somewhat unusual. That when textiles are used, they tend to be very sober and plain. And so here we are in the Malay world, and something else is going on. And if we look at some doublures, Alison?
Yes. Well, here again, it's this interesting combination. Here we have on the cover very much the Islamic sort of style layout of ornament with a flap, all right, and the border, and then you open up the book to find these very brightly colored floral doublures. When Paul and I looked at these, I think we both thought that these were European textiles. So this is another source coming in, and of course these are datable, to the 19th century. So it sort of fits the picture well. And we go on.
Also from that part of the world geographically, here are two rather interesting examples. The one on the left is a batik cloth made with wax resist. Mm. And the color combination, the patterns, unlike anything we have seen or will see. On the right is a brown fabric over which a filigree paper cutout has been applied. Again, a very unusual decorative form, given what we've seen in other parts of the Islamic world, and which we will continue to see. And I come back to these rather astonishingly bright, colorful floral cloths, which are in the Malay world, and contrast so greatly with the textiles that are being used elsewhere. And it's a speculation, but I think it's an interesting possibility to consider. As Georgios Boudalas has reminded us, the various manuscript traditions along the Silk Road have a great deal in common in terms of the techniques used for sewing and the materials that are used in the bindings and so on. But these books also have a really important function in their world as social identifiers. These are Islamic manuscripts. And I think it is fair to say that when groups of people live close together and they need their manuscripts to be distinguishable from other types, as we saw in the Armenian and Syriac and Ethiopic traditions, they use very bright, very bold patterns in the doublures. And that is not the case in the Islamic world, except for in this Malay tradition. And why might that be? And my suggestion as a possible lead for that research would be that in many of the other parts of the world, you have these Christian communities right next to their Islamic neighbors. So if the Christian manuscripts are using these very bright, boldly patterned fabrics, perhaps the Islamic ones needed to have something else. And yet in the Malay world, where this is not the case, that may actually be following the kind of the same idea, that in the Malay world, there wasn't a competitor tradition with which they needed to contrast, which allowed the use of textiles to go in an entirely new direction there.
Right, this is a Chinese Quran in the Chester Beatty Library, datable to the 18th century. And as you can see, is covered in patterned silk. And again, it's another example of how aspects of the Islamic book were combined with local traditions. You can see the flap, there's the aspect of it, but then of course they're using what I would presume to be Chinese silk. As you probably know, Islam has a long history in China. We're told that in the 7th century, the companion of the Prophet was sent as an envoy to the emperor, who ordered the construction of the first Chinese mosque in Guangzhou in the middle of the 7th century. So what I've tried to give you is an idea of all these different traditions and how textiles have been included in the making of the, if you like, the Islamic book. And I will now hand over to Paul, and that really concludes my very whistle-stop tour of textiles, the use of textiles in Islamic bindings. Thank you.
The slide that you're looking at, which was prepared by Karen, is to remind us that although the decorative use of textiles in Islamic manuscripts may be somewhat limited, there are 3 areas in which it is universal, which is the spine lining, the sewing, and the end banding. However, the doublures and the exterior covers, examples shown here, as I said earlier, are really quite rare statistically or numerically. And I think there's something to be seen on the right, particularly on the doublure, which is perhaps a factor. I would not think it would be an entire explanation, but textiles are very unforgiving, and they're very hard to use. And as you see here on the doublure, and as we saw in some of the other manuscript traditions, when you're gluing the textile down, the grain of the fabric is not lining up straight, and it is quite easy for the fabric, the glue, to soak through to the front and to create stains, and it also gets dirty and it looks dirty. So that aspect of fabric being a somewhat difficult medium may be one reason why textiles are not found as much as we might expect. In terms of the end bands, this is another area of potential research that is wide open. We do not know what is the earliest extant end band. No one's looked. We have in the sources fanciful names given to the patterns on these end bands, rat's tooth and baklava and other names. And we do not in general have good examples of these. So of the surviving many millions of end bands, probably 99% of them are chevron patterned. And tracing the development of the Islamic end band has yet to be done. So that would be a very exciting area of research, I think. This slide was to remind us, as we saw in the other traditions, that the spine lining on an Islamic manuscript is not intended to be seen, and can only be seen when damage occurs, which allows that hidden textile to be revealed to the observer. And Karen has grouped a bunch of these together for a purpose because she found that despite the variety of sources and provenances and different time periods for these manuscripts, blue and white fabric shows up with quite a lot of regularity. And that's an interesting aspect. Later then, in working on Yemeni manuscripts from the 19th century, again, she was able to find some blue and white references showing up again. And in terms of blue and white, that triggered something for me because I had just heard Amanda Phillips talk about blue and white fabrics in the Ottoman, well, excuse me, the Turkish world. And there are some surviving examples that you see here in the Konya Museum, which have a dervish background. So this raises the possibility that the blue and white reference may be an apotropaic function, and it's never been, to my knowledge, it hasn't been stated or revealed in any previous research. But the other interesting factor to these Mevlana museum pieces is that there were probably 15 to 20 robes that survived there from the 14th, 15th century, dervish robes. And they are all blue and white, either blue and white stripes or blue and white checks. So that's a very leading possibility. This slide, however, is to remind us that although blue and white shows up with remarkable regularity, it is not exclusive, of course, and that there are other colors and other kinds of patterns that do show up. In terms of textiles used as decorative, in a decorative way, in this case on the doublures, again, a wide variety of different manuscripts from different areas and different time periods, and green and blue clearly are preferred colors. But it's not just the color, it is also that plainness that I was describing earlier, which I think accords pretty well with what we saw in the Mamluk bindings as well. Although there were some delicate patterns in the fabrics, the overall effect is not one of bold, dashing colors or motifs. It's really quite sober, and this plainness seems to be quite widespread, except for in the Malay world. And in fact, in 19th century Chinese examples of Islamic manuscripts, again, we see very plain fabrics showing up in these uses on the doublure. As you saw earlier with the Mamluk stamping on the left, that clearly has a reference to textiles. But on the right is a very unusual binding where the motif also could very well have a textile reference. In this case, it's been painted onto the leather. And now we come to decorative textiles used on the exterior of bindings, which almost always, except for that Chinese example you saw earlier and maybe the Malay example, are these partial leather. That is, the fabric is framed in leather and then a panel of attractive material is used. And indeed, these are very attractive. And so it is still an open question then, why aren't there more of them? These partial leather bindings number in the thousands and thousands, and the vast bulk of them would have marbled paper or paste paper or plain colored paper in the panel instead of the textile. So why? Karin also wanted to remind us with this slide that here, these kinds of textiles on the exterior often do show up in catalogs, in the cataloging. But if we go to another one of these, and it has textile on the outside, as we just saw, but when we open it up, it has textile also on the flap, the envelope flap, the foredge flap, and in the damage on the spine, there's an even more interesting textile that's peeking its little way out there. And these do not end up in cataloging. So for this area of research to progress, we are clearly going to need to co-opt institutions and the people who do the cataloging to make these kinds of observations and to record them. As in the other manuscript traditions, threads and brightly colored cloth are also used as page markers. And here is a particularly beautiful example on a manuscript that Sabine Schmidtke is actively researching. In this case, these tufts of silk of so many bright and beautiful colors have been applied along the foredge. This slide is show 19th century manuscripts from Yemen and kind of a use of textile that we haven't really commented on before, which is as a repair material. Here, the leather binding has failed on the joints or on the spine, and the cloth has been rather crudely applied over it. The cloth doesn't seem to have a particular decorative function, but it certainly works for what it's intended to do. Here, however, are two bindings that are said to be from Central Asia, and that would certainly accord with the one on the left, which is a Suzani. And they have been, the fabric has been adhered over an earlier leather, which you can't see except maybe in a little corner at the top. But here, the aesthetic function of the textile is clear. It's a repair, but the textile itself is now a focus in the binding. And here's an example from Turkey that's kind of between those two. It's a repair. The original leather was covered in probably the late 19th, early 20th century. On the flap on the right, you see the original colors, which is a purple, very bright purple and bright red leather. And on the left, you see how the purple has faded. And as the fabric has pulled away, you can see the original 16th century binding. Now, there are a couple of things to note here, that by this time in the tradition, things have changed a lot, obviously, because the aesthetics involved in making the repair are completely different than the aesthetics involved in making the original binding, both in terms of colors and forms and what people thought was attractive. And at this point, the use of textiles has considerably relaxed from whatever normative use it had in earlier centuries. A similar example from Iran. The earlier binding has been covered, fortunately not pasted, but just covered with a textile probably from the 1950s. And finally, several manuscripts which show these bright colors and these bright patterns and bold patterns, and some of them are original bindings and some of them are cloth applied over an older binding. But the point here is that by this time in the tradition, they have relaxed whatever taboos had existed before in the use of textiles. This was potentially always possible in the earlier centuries for textiles to have been used in this way, but it was not. And so we are confronted with that question of why it was not and what to make of it. And that's something of a challenge because textiles in the Islamic world were central to their arts, their economies, their cultures. So why this restricted use of the textile in manuscript bindings? And I think one possible answer might be that we've stopped thinking about the manuscript and its extension, which is the enclosures that would have been used typically with many of these. And that would have been another area where textiles could have had a great function. And there is some proof, I think, for this argument. Here are some 16th century miniatures, and they show enclosures, one in the middle, the blue one, and then another blue one at the bottom. These have a flap, and they seem to be associated with people who are in reading and writing and doing scribal things. They could be leather, but the blue is not a typical color for leather, and the clear reference to decoration, which might well be embroidery on both of them, would accord well with thinking about them as textile enclosures. And we have two more in another miniature. Again, the colors in those enclosures are not typically leather colors, so again, could possibly be textiles. We do have even an early extant example of an embroidered leather from the 15th century. And in the Leiden Library, these two large Quranic manuscripts came into the collection in the 17th century, and quite by luck, I think, came with their silk bag. And this is extraordinarily rare because you can see how beat up the silk looks in comparison with the books, and how easy it would be to separate them and to lose that association. Another example from the Leiden collection, a tiny pouch with its cloth enclosure. And now here is a manuscript in a bag. We saw some of these also in the same form in the Armenian presentation. And I put the manuscript in the bag to show how it might have looked. But I want to remind everyone that when the bag is found dissociated from the manuscripts, it is very difficult, of course, to prove that in fact it was used exclusively for a manuscript. Bags could be used for a variety of things, and that poses certain problems with this line of research. Same thing for a wrapping cloth. We have hundreds and hundreds of, I'm sure thousands of surviving wrapping cloths, in this case one that's embroidered, where a valued or a Quran that's treasured by a family would be wrapped up in embroidered silk. Makes perfect sense, but when the wrapper is dissociated, how can we know that this one went with a manuscript as opposed to something else that was being wrapped up? And here is an example of what is said to be a Quranic slipcase, and it might be, I don't know, but it doesn't have the shape of it's very long. It doesn't have the shape of a typical Quran. And so I just am raising that again as the possibility that when we see bags, and certainly they're sold that way, oh, this is a book bag, we don't actually know for sure because there's no book. So we need to be thinking what else it might have been. Here are some late 19th century examples from the Ottoman world, and I have again shown one with a velvet partial leather binding just to show how feasible it would be. It did not come with it. I've paired it myself. And in looking at these bags, found another one which is quite typical. They often come with a strap, but the strap is very flimsy. It's sort of usually it's disintegrated and not exactly what you'd think you'd be carrying around with you. And my assistant, who is from Eastern Turkey, said, oh, well, that's because in our home, we hung our Quran on the wall. And apparently there are various religious admonitions that the Quran should not be below waist level. So, in fact, I then found examples such as those shown here of this tradition, which is now, at least in Turkey and Syria, pretty much in village and town use, not in the cities, but probably in the 19th century was something that was used by the higher classes. And you see an example on the right of a silver embroidered textile with its very disintegrated floppy strap. And this particular use makes a lot of sense to me because when I was seeing these on the market and people would say, well, they're book bags and that's the strap that you carry with them with. And I always thought, that's a very odd looking bag for a religious imam to be taking to the mosque. It just didn't feel right. And this function as a decorative device for hanging on the wall makes much greater sense. Here we have an original one with its Quran, and you can see how beautiful they are. And that is contrasting with a robust leather with some serious hardware at the top. which indeed would have been very useful for carrying a manuscript around and protecting it, unlike those ones that we saw before. We want to thank everyone who contributed so much to this preparation for this event. A special shout out to Melissa Morton, who really was there for us as we were trying to get our PowerPoint ready, but for all the people who gave us information and pictures, and a big thanks.